You've heard about the gentleman who cut the other gentleman's head off on a bus in Canada? You heard that story? And both my girlfriend and I at the time had this really dark feeling. And I said to her, this guy, this guy's scamming people, maybe even killing people. And the little kid again looked like he was like a ghost. She started crying. That's how intense. And the guy didn't do anything wrong. He was just saying, can I please get a ride out east? And I said, I saw you last summer. You said the same thing to me. Would your car break down again? And he just kind of scurried away with his kid.
Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I'm here speaking with Christopher Garetano, and he is a filmmaker, producer, director, and writer, and basically he's done stuff on really a bunch of conspiracy theory type shows. And well, anyway, we'll let him tell you what's going on. So check this out. What's going on?
Just got back from Texas shooting a movie, and I grew up watching a lot of horror films because my parents owned a video store when I was a kid. And one of the main leads in that movie was Lou Temple. He was in The Walking Dead and a lot of Tony Scott movies like Unstoppable and Deja Vu and stuff like that. But the other person was Edwin Neal, and he played a murderer, probably the most terrifying one in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And he scared the hell out of me when I was a kid. And I got to direct him in some scenes. And it was, for a kid growing up loving horror films, or at least having this kind of, it repels and attracts you at the same time. When you're a kid, you're into special effects makeup and you're into the whole air of the horror film. But something about Edwin Neal gave me nightmares when I was a kid. And to direct that guy in a movie was definitely a personal dream. Most people probably don't even know who the hell he is, but it was something else. Directing him in Texas, I've known him for a while, but I've finally had a chance to work with him. So that's one of the things that's happening, and I'm in the editing stages for that movie right now.
What's the name of the movie?
Name of the movie is called Love Bugs. I'm not the writer. The writer's Heidi James. She won a bunch of awards for the story. I connected with it on a visual level. I like the idea of it's kind of like on the precipice of the apocalypse, or kind of how we've been in the last few years. It's a Texas family living on a ranch, and some of them are in deep depression. The marriage is in great conflict between the husband and wife. The kids are kind of running off into their own imaginations, and it's a bit of a challenge as a movie maker to now take someone else's story and turn it into something. It goes through this many stages. It starts off as a script. The script isn't a movie. It's a blueprint. And so now your job as a director is to take this thing and, make it interesting for the audience. It's a whole new form. And you're taking, as you do with any novel or anything else, you're taking something into your own imagination, into your own filter. Because essentially when you're reading a novel, especially fiction, you're making your own movie. That's the script, but the way
Right.
you're interpreting it in your imagination is yours. And so essentially your job as a movie maker is to take how you're interpreting this literature and get it out on the screen.
Or I was going to say, that's why typically when people read a book and they go to the movies, they're always like, that's not the person that I perceived him to be. I had a different, that's not what, in my mind, it was different. Even though obviously, the book is always better, but
most of the time, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe in the case of Jaws and Gone Girl, the book wasn't better.
It's funny. I was just going to say that there's a few books where the movie was at least as good as the book, for like Fight Club. But then the book was so short,
Sure.
Same thing with like Catch Me If You Can. The book was so short. So it was easy to kind of, bring that over and show that, be able to visualize that or I guess recreate it. Because you didn't have to do a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe they combined a few scenes here and there. But overall, it was very much, Fight Club was very much what I had perceived when I read the book.
What a movie. I liked that it got all these bad reviews from stuffy critics at the time, and David Fincher put them on the ads the following week, like all of the nasty quotes he put.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was great.
I was just thinking, one of my favorite movies did horrible. It's Gattaca with
I
Ethan
love that
Hawke.
movie. That's a
Yeah, great.
fantastic movie.
Horrible reviews. Did horrible in the theater. I've watched that movie 40 or 50 times. I love that movie.
Yeah, no, that's a great movie. But that's the thing, though. But you changed that zeitgeist. There's a lot of people that love that movie, and I like movies. I like, I know movies well, and that's a good movie, and it has an incredible core to its message, and it's strong. It resonates with certain people. Maybe other people who gave it a bad review, it didn't touch, and perhaps they're not. They never had to fight for anything. They never had to go above and beyond, because really that's what the story is about.
Yeah, I was just thinking too. Well, I mean, there's so many movies like that, but then some movies get horrible reviews. The Wolf of Wall Street, and then it does amazing at the box office. The first week of reviews were horrible, and then of course it exploded and did great.
Yeah, another great movie. I met somebody who couldn't watch that movie and couldn't resonate with Scarface. Both great films. And obviously it's something personal. And that's my issue with critics, is that they'll take this personal quirk or something that they have against someone in their life that might be reminded or triggered by someone in a picture, and then write this scathing review. So I don't know, what was it that Stephen King said about critics in the 80s? It's like they were kind of worthless. In other words, because he was always bashed. Now he's kind of beloved, and it's a different time. Stephen King was a wild man in the 80s. He was an alcoholic, then just post-alcoholic, into drugs, a different guy growing up with that character. And he had no truck for critics whatsoever back then. And now he's held in regard for his, literary contributions much more than he was, because I think those critics died off. And now his fans have grown into critics, a lot of them. So
Right.
They support him.
Yeah, I was just going to say probably the movies I like best of Stephen King's, or the books that became movies, or like the more serious ones, like Misery.
Sure.
Green Mile, like those types of. I think he wrote Green Mile.
He did, yeah.
Yeah, like those were the more serious ones, are the ones that I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah. Stand By Me, he wrote too. A lot of people don't realize.
Right. Exactly. Same thing. It's, but still, did he? No, he didn't write Shawshank, did he?
He did, yeah.
I love that is my second favorite movie. It's like Gattaca and then Shawshank.
Such a great movie, Shawshank. Blown away by that movie. Yeah, both that and Stand By Me, which was The Body, was written in a book called Different Seasons.
It was a short story, right?
Yeah, I mean, longer form short story, because it was like 4 novellas, I guess, inside of Different Seasons. And that was written when he was the Stephen King of our youth, like he was a different guy back then. He was kind of a maniac, which I liked. He's a genius, but didn't really, and now he's on Twitter and getting involved in political discussions. And I mean, that was in the subtext of his work. I just feel like he's such an amazing guy. It's like beneath him to sit there and get involved in this stuff.
You mentioned the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I had watched. So I'd seen that movie, and never thought that it was. I don't know why. I guess I'd seen it, 20 or 30 years ago, the original, and then I had seen the original a couple times, and then I saw the remake. But I had never really put it together that it was, kind of semi-based on like a true story. And then I watched a documentary about the guy that they said inspired the movie.
Right. Ed Gein.
Yeah.
Creepy. A lot of those, I think the Ed Gein story is creepier than Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, there are so many similarities, and obviously the Gein story inspired Robert Bloch to write the novel Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock ended up turning into that famous movie. But Gein did live alone in an isolated farmhouse. He did prey on people, watch them, calculate them, and then bring them to the farmhouse, dismember them, murder them, dismember them. He turned their bones into furniture. He turned their faces into skin masks. I mean, this, all of the stuff that's in Chainsaw Massacre happened,
Yeah, he had some issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, it's a disturbing. It was it's a documentary. It's on YouTube. Like I do stuff where, I paint and so I'll paint and put on documentaries, and I think I've worked through but just about every World War II documentary they have. And so, every once in a while I'll put something else on, and yeah, that was extremely disturbing. And then eventually I think he got older and he was in a mental asylum, right? And then at some point they were allowing him to get day passes, and people in town would see him walking around town. And
Sure. Yeah, as an older man, I think he died in his 80s, and it was such a gruesome, brutal murderer. I mean, these days perhaps it would be handled differently.
oh yeah, they have no sympathy for, like, you have mental illness or something. The prisons are filled with like I was in Coleman in the medium security prison, and there are guys that they're absolutely schizophrenic, walking around talking to themselves,
Wow.
having arguments with themselves, and they were maybe addicted to crack or something, and they had multiple charges. They end up getting tied into a federal crime. They end up in a federal prison, and then they have a special unit where there would be someone with mental problems. Maybe it's just extreme, bipolar condition, or they've got schizophrenia, bipolar. There were guys there that had oh gosh, what do you call it? That, like, I mean, the most extreme version of narcolepsy you've ever seen, where the guy's walking and all of a sudden he'd just stop for a minute or two, and then he'd start walking again. This happened, like, he couldn't get across the compound, which is essentially like a city block long, right? Or let's say a football field, maybe. He couldn't get across the compound without stopping for 2 or 3 minutes, and he'd do it multiple times. Guys that were in the unit with him said he would be watching television and all of a sudden just fall out of his chair and hit the ground and be asleep.
So and this is it raises an interesting question, and you were there. It's like, could someone like Geen get away with similar crimes within the walls of a prison? And has that happened? I'm sure something in that realm has occurred.
Oh, in state prisons, there's murders all the time. And there's lots of murders. And in Coleman, there was actually a murder where a guard was upset with another inmate. There was an inmate that was giving a female guard a hard time. And so she stuck another inmate in that cell with him and told him to break his arm. Well, the guy, they got into a fight and the guy ended up killing him. So, and there's also cases where the guards would, and this is typically state prison, but it also happens in federal prison, where the guards know there's two rival gangs and they control the prison. In the maximum security prisons, they can control your movement by opening doors. So a bunch of guys go here, then they close the door and they open the other door. Then they open another door and go that way. So you go that way. And they would call them, gladiator games. And the guards would get two rival gang members and put them in the same hallway or the same room. And they'd be like, oh, it was a mistake, I didn't realize. And then, of course, they have shanks on them. They pull them out and they get into a fight and one guy kills the other guy.
What do you think it is that changes the guards' perspective? Because I'm sure once they graduate from their training, they don't have the intention to get involved in what you're talking about. What is it that eventually gets them to this place where they try to, their perspective on the inmates are that they're basically rats in a maze and they can toy with their lives like that? Like, how does that change?
I think one, you've got, you have two different types of guards. And so one of the guards that really don't bother anybody, the guys that are like, look, I'm here to get a paycheck and go home. You guys don't get into any trouble. Don't get me into any trouble. And they're not looking for, to bother anybody. Then you have other guards that really have attitudes. Like, they clearly are there because they don't have the ability to control their emotions enough to be a police officer, but they like to be in a position of power. And so those guys will taunt inmates and pick on them, and keep in mind too, the other problem is that the inmates, are a lot of times they bring it on themselves. So you've got a bunch of guys that don't follow the rules, and then you've got a bunch of guards that have, they have authority, they have a very authoritarian, mentality where they want to just really want to boss someone around and be in charge and push them around, and they have control issues. And so that's a problem. And I also think that just in general, there was a study that was done by, I forget the university, I'm sure you've heard about this, where they had two different sets of students. Some of the students were were inmates, and some of the students were guards. And there were certain things that the guards could do and the inmates couldn't do. And this happened over the course of about 10 days. And literally the guards became more and more abusive to the inmates as time went on. And I want to say there was even a death at some point.
Wow.
It was, I really wish I knew the study. And it was a big deal. It was a university study, and it was, I want to say like 20 years ago. I want to say there was even maybe a movie or a TV show made about it. And what happens is you just, you get into that position. Like, let's face it. If murder wasn't, a felony, if it was a misdemeanor or something, there would be murders all the time. I mean, people would, I think people if they were just given carte blanche to do whatever they want, they would do horrific things to one another.
I agree.
Species. We're a horrible species.
Yeah. At first I didn't believe that. And, those movies like The Purge were coming out, and I'm like, this is so far-fetched, it would never happen. But I believe 100% it's a strong possibility that
have you watched
that would happen.
Have you watched any of The Handmaid's Tale?
I haven't.
Listen, you think it's far-fetched, but it's really not. Like, these are things that are happening in other countries and have been happening for 100 years. We're talking about, the women are subjugated to certain roles, the men are held to a certain standard. Like, it's not far-fetched. Is it far-fetched here? Yeah. But does it happen? Do all of these things happen in some other part of the world right now? Absolutely. And if there were to be some type of a military coup, I very much believe that scenario could occur. And what's funny is that after a couple of generations, it just doesn't seem that big of a deal to you anymore.
Sure. I think, is it that some of us are genetically different? Because I think some of us genuinely don't want problems and could get along with each other just fine.
Yeah.
And then some of us have this propensity to want violence, want to dominate other people, want to be in control of the situation.
Definitely. Yeah. Some people I think are just very agreeable people. They're not aggressive or assertive. And then of course, other people are super prone to violence, and that's their go-to move. And when I was in prison, obviously that whole time, you very quickly get that feeling from someone. You can just walk up and talk to somebody and realize that this guy could snap. He seems fine, but I'm looking at him thinking, no, this is a guy who's willing to resort to violence very quickly.
What are the factors? Like, what are the telling factors? Is it instinct or is it something else?
They have unfortunately, my answer is probably not a good one. I'm a big believer in intuition. And I think, and you very quickly get that feeling like something's off. This guy's a little bit too assertive, a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too, just more so than other people. And even their movements, you can tell, this guy's super aggressive. He hasn't said anything aggressive, but the answers are too quick. They're too clipped. He doesn't want to explain himself. It's yes, no. You get that feeling where you're like, this guy, this is a bad guy.
And how do you deal with somebody like that? Because I'm sure there's a way to manipulate that person into either calming down or just going in another direction.
I think I think most people, there's a way to manipulate them. Not everybody, but right. Like most people, you know, you do, gosh, what was his name? He was a con man. He came up with the con man. They're like rules of the con. Oh shoot. I even did a painting of him. He sold the Eiffel Tower twice. Oh, what's his name?
He once conned Bank of America out of $250,000 using nothing but a fake ID and his charm. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't typically commit crime, but when I do, it's bank fraud. Stay greedy, my friends.
Support the channel. Join Matthew Cox's Patreon.
Anyway, he had a list. He had a list of like how to endear yourself to someone in order to con them and gain their trust. And it was that you ask them a lot of questions about themselves. People love to talk about themselves. And then you find out what their religious points of view are, and you agree with them. You take on those. You find out what their stance on politics are, and you agree with them. You just become very agreeable with everything that they say. You do not argue. And then he had certain things that you don't ever bring up or talk about. And if they did, then you just smile and kind of agree, but you don't ever feed into it. Like I think he talks about, like if they talk about their sexual conquests or sex, you smile and nod, but don't play into it too much. Like he had a whole list of them. It was like 10 rules of the con or something. What was his name? I can't believe it. He sold the Eiffel Tower twice. He was, I mean, that's amazing. Con man that sold the Eiffel Tower. What is his name? Oh, I know. Okay. Yeah. Victor Lusting.
Victor Lusting.
Yes. Victor.
So it seems like if you play to the ego and not blatantly, you know, because then sometimes people are sharp and they're like, what are you trying to do?
Oh yeah. You have to be good at it, right? You have to, you know, and then obviously, I mean, you know, the problem is that not everybody can even do that. I mean, how many people do you know that just cannot be agreeable? Like they have to argue about everything. Like even if it's in their best interest, they cannot not argue about things.
Sure. I know people that, you know, you're in a room with them and they need to be the loudest one, even if their voice isn't particularly loud. They need to be noticed constantly. And usually, you know, that's out of insecurity. Like they need that. They need it.
It's the same thing with narcissism or arrogance. It's all out of insecurity, right? Like
sure. Now, would you say in prison, it's a large collection of people like that, all trying to get that attention?
It depends on I would say in the low security, where there's more con men in a low security prison. I was in a medium for 3 years, and then I went to a low security. In the low security, you tend to get a lot of these non-violent, not a lot, but you do get a lot of, you know, white collar criminals, like kind of like Jordan Belfort. You know, right. Like Jordan Belfort's not going to get into a fight with you. He's not going to get an argument with you. I mean, a physical altercation, but he's extremely agreeable. He's, you know, it's very easy for him to lure you in and coerce or convince you or manipulate you into his way of thinking. And I've met a ton of guys like that. And they, you know, they obviously, it's almost like sales. Like they have different, some of them are more educational. Like they explain to you why what they're saying is correct. And other guys, it's high pressure where they almost humiliate or embarrass you into the sale. Like, you know, it's the whole, what, you know, oh, well, I got to talk to my wife. You got to talk to your wife. Does your wife make all your decisions? Bro, are you not running your house? Like what's going, and it's like, you know, so you're sitting there going like, wow, this guy, you know, he's humiliating. Well, you can't afford it. Is that it? Is it the money? You can't afford this? I mean, it's $400. I mean,
sure. And where some of us would walk away at that minute.
Right.
But other people want to prove themselves.
Exactly. Then they get a certain type of person and they will play into that. No, of course of course. No, if I tell them if I want to do it, I can afford that. Of course. Next thing you know, they're signing papers for a car they don't even want.
Sure. And you think about serial killers like Ted Bundy, who would simply walk up to someone on a beach I mean, this woman was sitting on her towel, and he has a fake sling on his arm. And he goes up to her and says, "Hey, can you help me move this boat?"
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
right? Like, what about, oh gosh. It's funny. Did you read the book, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo?
I saw the David Fincher movie. I didn't see the original, and I didn't read the book.
Okay, same thing. It's the scene is in the movie where he goes, where the Blumquist or whatever his name is, the reporter, where he catches him like outside of his house, and he says, "Come on in." He knows something's wrong. He believes this guy's a serial killer.
Sure.
He knows he's dangerous. Yet he's more offended. He doesn't want to hurt his feelings or be embarrassed, so he goes into the house with the serial killer, and the guy pulls a gun on him and obviously, tries to kill him. It's like that's the kind of thing like that kills me. Like, I forget what the serial killer's name was, but he actually had pulled over, got a flat tire, had pulled over, changed the tire with his victim in the car, got out and went to go open the door, and he had locked his keys in the car. And he told the victim, "Open the door," and she leans over and opens the door for him. "You're locked in the car with the keys. He's changed it. What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I killed her within an hour."
Was that the Zodiac or no?
No, I don't think it was the Zodiac.
Okay.
It was because they didn't catch him. So he couldn't. This guy actually told the story.
Oh boy.
Where he was like, yeah, he's like, I would just ask somebody to get in the car. Or I would tell them, "Hey, I'm here to pick you up for whatever the reason is. Your mother told me," and they'd get in. He's like, "I don't know their mother name. I don't know anything." I get in the car and take them somewhere and, rape them and kill them, leave their body somewhere.
I encounter, okay. You've heard about the Long Island serial killer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still at large. No, he hasn't been caught. He's been suspected to be law enforcement for a while, but they haven't been able to prove that. And I feel like I ran into him 2 different summers. So I'm walking around the town of Smithtown. This is years ago. And this guy comes up, and he has a kid with him. The kid has hollow eyes. Like the kid looks like he's not even there. And I remember seeing this child, and I'm like, there's something wrong here. And the guy's walking up to people saying, "Listen, my car broke down. Can you give me a ride out east to my home so I can get my second key, so I can talk to my wife?" And he has this little boy with him. And I just had, like you said, I had a really bad feeling. And I was walking around with my girlfriend at the time in town. Town was crowded. People were moving in and out of restaurants and bars and, having a good time. And he's walking up to people with this kid. And I looked at him and I said, "Sorry, man." He's like, "I'll pay you $50. Can you just drive me out east?" And I'm like,
"Good."
Yeah. I said, "No, man, not a good idea." So throughout the following year, these murders keep happening. Some bodies were found in the place that he wanted to drive through, which was a Pine Barren type area. Okay. There were torsos found there. So then the following summer, same guy, same kid, same story, comes up to me again. And both my girlfriend and I at the time had this really dark feeling. And I said to her, this guy's scamming people, maybe even killing people. And the little kid again looked like he was like a ghost. She started crying. That's how intense. And the guy didn't do anything wrong. He was just saying, "Can I please get a ride out east?" And I said, "I saw you last summer. You said the same thing to me. Would your car break down again?" And he just kind of scurried away with his kid.
Oh, something's wrong.
Is it possible that he was using this kid to disarm people? Didn't the BTK killer or one of those guys use a child to disarm people and
I know his daughter wrote a book.
Yeah, something like that. But there's that thing that you would never expect, that the serial killer could be using a child to, well, if this kid is here, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah. And I reported it to the police. I don't know what they did, but
people are horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible. The Bundy thing with the cast. And of course they use that whole thing in for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, where he also has like a cast trying to get get it was a piece of furniture in the back of a car.
Sure. Yeah, he was an amalgam of a few serial killers, Ed Gein included, the skin suit. He was cutting off their skin.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Oh man. It's I was thinking about the Saw series.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I saw the Saw series, or I think I'd only seen 1 or 2 of them. And I thought, this is so over the top ridiculous. Like, somebody would build these machines and do this and do that. And shortly after that, I was in prison, and the pizza bomber came out. Remember the pizza bomber where he thing? So I was in prison with the guy that made the device. There was like 3 people involved, including the guy that got his head blown off. So the guy that made the device, he was a fat, older, dumpy, kind of a dumpy guy. And he was in prison. He died in prison with me.
Wow.
I spoke with him a couple of times, and I remember he told me, well, it wasn't our fault. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, I mean, he said, first of all, he's like, the guy that got his head blown off was in on it. He's like, he knew and I said, why did you even set the device? He said, well, because if he got caught, we needed him to be able to say, like, I wouldn't put a bomb on my neck. He said it would have worked even if he got caught. He said the bomb squad just got there too late. He said that's not my fault. And I thought, you're delusional.
Yeah.
Like, no, not taking any responsibility.
See, this raises an amazing question, because these guys are creative. You have to safely assume, because it's always been the word on the street that horror films, crime films don't inspire crime, and they should be fine. And well, I think for some people they do. I mean, there have been cases where way back, there was a kid that put on the Jason hockey mask and went and killed his family. So for most of us, we can watch these horror films and not imitate them. But I think in some cases, murderers would be inspired by music, movies. Why not? Just like we all are. We're just like, I'm inspired to make other movies. Some of us are inspired to change your behavior. Some of us are inspired to change your style, right? Why wouldn't a murderer get excited about watching murder movies, and get...
Listen, when I was making, I think when we spoke earlier, and you were kind of, we were kind of feeling each other out, telling each other like, hey, what did you do? And I was explaining what my crime was. So when I made these synthetic identities, what I did was I convinced Social Security to issue me Social Security numbers to people that didn't exist. So, that took some paperwork, and I had to go in and explain, hey, I would tell them I have a 10-month-old daughter or 10-month-old son that was born with a midwife at home. And the pediatrician told me I needed to come in here and get a Social Security card issued. And I would give him a birth certificate for a 10-month-old child and a shot record showing that he'd gotten all of his shots. Because if the child was over the age of over 12 months old, then you have to bring the child in. Well, I didn't have a kid to bring in. But if he's under 12, you don't have to bring the kid. You just come in with the shot record and the birth certificate. So I did. And they would issue a Social Security number to any name on that birth certificate. So the bulk of the names I came up with were from the movie Reservoir Dogs. So it was like Michael White, Lee Black, Brandon Green, James Red, William Blue, David Silver. And obviously that was inspired because I liked the movie Reservoir Dogs.
It's a great movie.
Yeah. I couldn't do a Mr. Pink. It was just too much, but I went with the color coded, names. And that was definitely inspired by a movie.
Sure. And again, I'll never condemn the content of motion pictures, but of course, movies, music has an enormous influence. It changed the world. Certain genres of music have changed people. They change. You're changed by what you read, what you ingest, what you listen to. Most of us won't go out and murder because of it. But even when we were kids, I grew up with G.I. Joes playing 8 hours a day, having, these epic wars. And what are you inspired to do by the time you're 18? You do consider joining the Marine Corps, so it's like there is conditioning and programming and a lot of stuff, somewhat unintentional. We don't want a fleet of serial murderers, but there are plush renditions of Freddy Krueger, who's a child murderer, and you go to these horror conventions and there are kids running around with little dolls of Freddy. It's a weird thing. No, we're weird creatures.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking about mental illness. I had been in prison with a guy. So originally I got 26 years in prison. I had my sentence reduced twice while I was incarcerated. The person that helped me do the paperwork was a disbarred attorney who was in prison with me. He did my paperwork. His name was Frank Amadeo. And I ended up writing a book about Frank Amadeo called It's Insanity. He is a rapid cycling bipolar with features of schizophrenia. And there's actually a documentary called 9 Days in the Congo about how he tried to take over the Congo. I think it ended up being over 200 million, but I think the estimate that I went with was 180 million, but in the end it was over 200 million that he'd stolen from the US government. And so I sent you the trailer.
Yeah, I watched it. I was pretty blown away at how far he got with this.
It is so over the top insane. Ultimately what happened was he was, when they were in the Congo and he had backed this political candidate, they had gone from like number 30 down to number 3 before the candidate in second position, who was a general, he ends up arresting a bunch of Amadeo's security forces, including the guy running the campaign for the candidate and the whole thing. There's 32 of them. They arrest them and hold them for 9 days. There's articles about it and everything. And as a result of that, they end up basically backing off. He had 32 guys arrested. Amadeo says that they weren't armed, but the Congolese, they said they were armed. And there was another, I think, 20 or 30 guys that were in a Marriott or a Hilton or something that they didn't arrest. They arrested these other guys who had a second location. And then some of these guys, he had guys that were like ex-CIA or ex-Secret Service, ex-FBI, ex-Mossad. He had security forces. He was trying to buy a bunch of airplanes. It's an insane story. That's one of the stories that I mentioned to you when we were talking. I was like, that's one of those stories where he's so difficult to deal with that I can't get a documentary made about him. He's never going to really probably cooperate.
And why do you think that is? Why won't he? And I have a few definitely raised a questions. I'm so curious about this because we as a species, like I mentioned the Freddy Krueger thing, it's like we admire these things from afar for some reason. That story, everybody would go see that movie and they would get a leading man to play him. And
Oh, I missed the most important part. Matter of fact, when we're done, I want to get your address and I'm going to send you the book.
Yeah, sure, man. I'd love to read it.
And it's short. I think it's like 200. Is it like 190, 180, 190 pages? It's not long.
No, I'm excited to read this.
What I was going to say was, okay, since he was in his early teens, he has been hearing the voice of God telling him he's preordained to be emperor of the world. And listen, and he became a lawyer. He was a huge bankruptcy attorney. Then he ended up becoming a venture capitalist, started buying companies that were failing, combined them together, and he's essentially was committing his crime. So he's a James Bond. Let me put it this way. He's a James Bond villain. He was creating a company in order to take over the world, as if that's even possible. But he believes it. And it was kind of a running joke. It wasn't something he was hiding. Like everybody that was around him, he used to say, well, when I take over the world, and he would talk about it like it was a joke. And I interviewed some of his former employees and partners. And they were like, yeah, I mean, he would say it. And he goes, you know, we'd laugh a joke about it. And I go, so you thought he was joking? They were like, no, he wasn't joking. We knew that. And I was like, so why would you keep following him? They said, one guy told me, this guy, Woody, told me this. He said it the best. He said, it seems insane that you would follow this person. He goes, but he was winning. He said, do you understand? He was buying these companies, turning them around, and they were making massive profits. He goes, everything he was touching was working. So is he quirky? He goes, yes. He said, lots of people are quirky. Lots of CEOs have quirks. They're strange people. You have to be. He goes, but he said he just inspired a willingness to believe in him. And the problem was, by the time I interviewed Woody, I also interviewed another guy, Naviv. I also interviewed him for the book. The problem with when these guys said these things is that because I had been in prison and Frank represented me from inside prison, he's an inmate in prison. He got 13 years. No, wait. 12 years. He got 12 years knocked off my prison sentence. So when these guys say, you have to understand he inspired you to follow him and believe in him, like, I believe that. He got 12 years knocked off my sentence. I understand he sounds insane, but you do believe him. You follow him. I mean, I don't think God's talking to him, but I'll tell you who does believe it. Amadeo believes it.
Wow.
There's no doubt in my mind that when he says it, you know he believes it 100%. You have to read this book.
Perhaps God is talking to him.
Exactly. You know, it's so funny. And this is like, at one point, when I was finishing up, because first I wrote a synopsis while I was incarcerated. Then I got out and I went and interviewed several guys that had worked with him. And I interviewed a former CIA agent, and I ended up expanding the book. You could only expand it so much. So one time when I was finishing up the synopsis in prison, I said to Frank, I said, well, you know, Frank, I said, because Frank, he got 22 years in prison. I said, Frank, I said, you know, I said, if you have to serve out your entire sentence, I said, you'll be like 70 years old. I go, there may not be enough time to take over the world. And he looked, without missing a beat, as soon as I said that, I said, there may not be enough time, to take over the world. He looked at me and he goes, Moses started at 90.
So do you think when he gets out, he's going to get right back to it?
He is out.
Oh, he's out now. Okay.
He got himself out on what's called the first, is it Second Chance Act or First Chance Act? Second Chance Act. Anyway, where if you've served more than 50% of your time and you're over a certain age, they'll let you out on house arrest. And also because of COVID, he's older. So because he's older, you're more susceptible to COVID. So he is on house arrest right now. They've already violated his probation once and threw him back in jail for 6 months because they said basically he was doing the same thing he was doing prior to going to prison, which is he was getting these large companies that were having problems, and he's going in and he's acting as a consultant to combine the companies. So they threw him in jail, and they made up some reason that they said, oh, we're violating him because he left the jurisdiction without permission. And then they proved he went, of course, 6 months later when he got in front of the judge, he proved that wasn't true. So they had to let him back out.
Yeah. I mean, for someone so staunch, someone so convicted, someone so adhered to his path, I don't believe this is something that he'll ever stop doing. He might lie to you and tell you, oh, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm done. That's the past.
Yeah, I'm all better now.
Yeah, no.
He's not all better now. He's going to, honestly, if you read the book, you will. My problem is, as I'm sure you know, it's much easier to get the budget for a documentary. And if you can make a documentary and you've got that intellectual property created, unlike a book, I've created this intellectual property in the form of a book, but it's still difficult. It's hard to go to someone and say, hey, will you read a 250-page book or 200-page book? Or even, hey, will you guys, I don't know, listen to it? Like I even have it on Audible. Would you listen to it? It's hard to get someone to do that. as opposed to going and getting the money to do some kind of either a sizzle reel or even a full-length documentary. Now that I've got the documentary and it's a real thing and it's serious and it's amazing, now I can maybe get a series. Like to me, I see a House of Cards type of series with this guy.
Oh yeah, that story's fantastic. I mean, you would think the people in the industry would have a voracious appetite for the literature that they're about to make a motion picture or a series about. I've run into a lot of, I've made television shows, so I as a producer, as a host, as a director, and co-executives or people you meet in the boardroom, they'll gloss over things. And I'm like, you're not in the right business. You should be doing something else.
Yeah.
Because it behooves the entire company for someone to be really, truly interested in reading that book. Like all the heads of the company should be like, we're finishing it this week or tonight. I'm going to go read this in one sitting because that's my work. And if everyone had that passion for it, the quality of the pictures would be better, therefore affecting the audience. This is how I see it. So to be in control of your own work is so much better than to be part of a bigger company, which I've done. I've made shows for Discovery and History and stuff like that. And I just produced 2 on my own for a fraction of the cost, but the quality is better. And I can tell you exactly how that happened. In this case, though, I think you would need a little more because it's such it's a larger story, yet a creative person can figure out how to tell that story for less and still retain its quality,
I genuinely thought like a documentary would be a great way to get the ball rolling.
Sure.
But Amadeo's not going to. He's just not going. The reason is, so, and I've said this to people before when I've spoken with people that have spoken with him and tried to talk to him about, being involved. And he'll talk to you forever and he'll spin you and spin you and spin you. But in the end, he wants complete control. I want to, it's not going to work. He's difficult to deal with.
Is there a way to, is there any chance he's going to see what I'm about to say?
I don't honestly, I don't think I don't think I'm even on his radar, although like he's never reached out to me. He knows I'm in Tampa. We speak to the same people, but I do not think that he thinks, everybody's always saying, why haven't you reached out to him? Well, I haven't reached out to him because something happened. I wrote his synopsis, which he absolutely loved. And it was very, he's very open about his mental, issues. Well, while he was in prison, he loved the story. I got out of prison and we communicated with each other through the prison email system. And he actually was contacting people outside, former business partners and employees, telling them to speak with me. And I was scheduling times to speak with these people because he knew I was expanding his synopsis into a full-length book.
Right.
Well, suddenly he found out he was going to be released. And he thought he had another 10 years or so to go. Well, now suddenly he thinks he's going to be released. And he immediately contacted everyone and told them not to be interviewed with me or by me. Now, here's the reason why. I think his thing was he wanted to be there and be in charge of all media and all, all this stuff. And it was like, okay, well, this is a book and you've already seen what I'm going to write. Like, there's no reason to be, he trusts me. So I tried to go back and forth with him about it. And he basically stopped answering the emails. And here's the way I see it. I think that deep down, he kind of thought to himself, he was going to be incarcerated for the next 10 years, even though he was fighting his case, but there's a very good likelihood that they were just going to keep him in prison. So when he found out he's going to be out, he thought, hey, this is a second chance for me. Now, what is cool to talk about and joke about and discuss in prison isn't cool in the real world.
Sure.
Him being okay with everybody knowing his mental defects and all of the things that he was involved in prison makes him a super celebrity and an amazing individual. Like, I've never met anybody that's actually committing their crime in the hope of taking over the world. That's insanity. So but people loved Frank, and Frank was helping tons of inmates. He's doing legal work for nothing. Listen, like, honestly, I will never, if I even really think about it, I'll tear up and cry. I will never be able to repay this guy for what he did for me, because every single lawyer I spoke with on the street told me, you cannot force the government to reduce your sentence. He did it twice.
It's amazing. He's a genius. You know?
He is. And I literally, I didn't let him look at my stuff or want to approach him for probably a couple years, because I had heard, because guys are snickering, like, this guy thinks he's going to take over the world. He's in here. Like, there were articles going around about him in the Orlando Sentinel talking about how he was plotting to take over like small former Soviet bloc countries, and he had tried to take over the Congo, and like, they're going, it's like, it's a joke. But then
perhaps there's a way to, I don't want to say manipulate him in a nefarious way, but manipulate him in a way where he thinks he's in control of the situation, yet you are, and then you can incorporate that into the doc. That's what you had to do. Right. That would be interesting. So let's say, this is just hypothetically speaking, you have dummy cameras, and he even has control of where you want to place them, but they're not recording. You actually have one A cam that's doing all the work, and he just doesn't know where you're placing what. I don't know if that's too much of a ruse to him, and that might offend what you just said, because you have respect for what he did for you.
Oh, I'm not above manipulating a situation. What I had thought about was, did you ever see Anna and the Wolves?
I haven't. Okay. So
the documentary is based on this woman, Anna, whatever her name is. She says she was Jewish, and she had escaped the Nazis, and she'd survived in the wolves in the woods for several months with wolves, and eventually escaped from whatever, Germany or Austria to some other country. And she was found and saved and eventually brought to the United States. And so she does this whole story. Now, it turns out the whole story is she's not Jewish. She wasn't saved. There were no wolves there, but there's a whole documentary on her. She had a best-selling book about this. It was a huge book. It was huge in like Germany or Austria. And then they were going to make a documentary about her. It's a whole thing. She was supposed to be on Oprah. She canceled at the last minute. It was huge. Well, they did a whole documentary, but she refused to be interviewed. So what they did was, there were several podcasts where she had spoken on the podcast, and there were several interviews in articles. Plus, they had the book. So they hired an actress to play her in the documentary.
Right. That was another suggestion on the tip of my tongue, and I did not know about this. Just as a creative guy, I'm coming up with ways you could do this.
Well, there's also, did you ever see Bad Vegan?
I've heard of it. I've not seen it.
Bad Vegan, there's one of the participants in Bad Vegan, one of the people that are interviewed, that is a fictitious character, but he's throughout like it's like a 4-part series. Like 3 of the series, he's being interviewed. And then in the end, you realize, oh, he's fake. Like, he's not even real. Like, he disappears when you realize that he's actually one of the other participants pretending to be him, and they're just reading the emails that went back and forth.
Right.
So what's happened is, like I was saying, I have enough transcripts and interviews and articles and everything else that it's exactly what Amadeo said, where if you just did an interview where someone played him, and then you could interview other people, you can put together, even if it's
100%, 100%. And that's the great thing about documentary movie making, is that you have such artistic license. I made that Montauk Chronicles picture. However, that's what's exciting about documentaries or docudramas, is that it seems to be this blank slate that you could do anything with. Whereas there are certain rules to other types of filmmaking. In this case, you can just play so much with it, as long as I think you're being honest about what you're documenting. If you're staging things and faking the whole story, I don't like those.
Yeah, no. I mean, this is all like, these are interviews from him, and I have tons of transcripts where he's said everything that is in the book is, I can show you. Oh, I got that from here? Other than just interviewing him over the course of a couple months, then I talked to this partner, I talked to this former employee, I pulled this from these transcripts. Listen. When I was reading the transcripts, you've done research on books or on.
Oh yeah.
So
Tons.
he told me a lot of things about his behavior, but I was reading the transcripts in his sentencing, and I had heard him say that he would put on like a Darth Vader mask sometimes and walk down the hallway, or sit in his office and people would come in and he'd be in the Darth Vader mask and they'd sit down. He said he was so erratic, and people were so, because of his bipolar condition, people a lot of times he would act crazy and they wouldn't even say anything. This woman in a transcript said they were questioning her and they said, did you not realize that that there were mental issues? And she said, well, I had heard things. And they said, did you ever witness anything that would tell you that he had some mental issues? And she said, well, he did come into a board meeting one time wearing a Darth Vader helmet. And he conducted the entire meeting in the Darth Vader helmet and then left. She goes, and nobody ever said anything.
No, they didn't. they want to get their paychecks at the end of the day.
Right. And then what's so funny is this guy, Yaniv, said the same thing. He goes, oh, he would put on a Darth Vader helmet and he'd walk down the hallway with his security detail. He looked like a little Darth Vader with a bunch of stormtroopers behind him. I mean, this is an interview. You can't make that up. I mean, this is good stuff. Not to mention, if I told you all the things that happened in the book, you would say this is the most insane thing I've ever heard. But he's also stealing and making millions. We're not talking about 10 million, 20, 30, 40. We're not at 100. We're talking about a couple $100 million.
Sure.
I have photographs of him with George Bush in the White House, in the Roosevelt room with heads of NATO.
Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you have an innate super intelligence mixed with obviously some disorders, probably a very creative guy. And he probably, there's so many secrets that a person holds that they won't reveal in conversation. So whatever he told you is what he decided to tell you. I'm sure there's a lot more going on. His decision-making process, what influenced him. Obviously he's wearing pop culture masks, so he's into movies, he's into pop culture. I'm sure there's so much more to him in that sense. You could really deeply psychoanalyze this man. Great story.
By the way, the empire, once he took over the world, it was going to be known as the Terror Empire, which terror is from Star Trek.
Right.
He loves Star Trek. I mean, it goes on and on. I've got to send you the book. You're going to go, this is insane. But I really do think that the only way to do it is by getting an actor. And then I think what happens is at the end of the film or the end of the documentary, as he's the actor standing up and you're unmiking him, he ends up saying something along the lines of, so where's the real Amadeo? And they're, he wouldn't do the interview. And, you kind of just explain it in that way.
That's an interesting reveal, or it's either that and you just tell the audience immediately that what you had to do, that he is so enigmatic that he just won't do it. Right. However, you have enough and this is how you're going to portray it. But I like that idea too. I mean, it's all in the execution. It really is,
At the end of Anna and the Wolves, they just throw it up on the screen. They just do the narration, where they explain that we took all this from transcripts and from different podcasts and different interviews of her, and it's a composite of those interviews, and this person was an actor. Boom, that's it.
See, but that's another creative thing. It's not just a way to fill in a hole. I think it makes it more interesting to do it that way. Like, for instance, I just did this thing where I hired an actor and I wanted to see what he would feel. There was a gentleman who had died. He had fell really, people thought it was a murder scene when the emergency crew got there and the police got there, but it was really just a gentleman who slipped in the bathroom, hit his head, bled all over the place. So what we did is we had this actor kind of go through the motions, and then I would, almost like a decompression chamber in between these recreations, would have him sit in the makeup chair and then interview him. And this is for something about hauntings, because the people in the house have experienced some things that I believe them. These people normally wouldn't say they had any kind of encounter with something from some kind of world beyond, but they came out and told me their story. So I had this actor go through the motions as the gentleman who died, in the places where he was injured, laying down in the place where he died. And even if it was just psychological suggestion, it made it much more interesting than these jackassy ghost shows that you see on TV where people are just running around faking it. Like, I thought this was more of an interesting scenario for the audience to see perhaps how this gentleman was feeling in an alleged haunted location, where he was going through the motions of the man who died in the places where he died. The very place where this man expired is where I had the actor lay down with blood all over him and everything. And it was just an interesting thing. And that's how you can play with the dynamics of a documentary that way. So there are solutions to not having this gentleman actually in the chair for his interview. Might make it even more interesting in the long run.
Yeah.
And more mysterious.
Yeah. Well, and on, I hate to put it like that, but this way you have full control, because you just don't know. Like, I've spoken with a production company, and they've been like, we've been kind of going back and forth about it. And one of the things that they were pushing, like, we'll really need him, we need this, we need that, and I was like, listen, like, and he said he'll be interviewed. I'm like, yeah, but then he didn't call back, or then he wouldn't answer your call, and then he put it off, and then this, like, it just keeps spinning and spinning. And I'm like, listen, you have to understand, I spent years in prison with them.
He built some of the nation's largest banks out of an estimated $55 million, because $50 million wasn't enough, and $60 million seemed excessive. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't typically commit crimes, but when I do, it's bank fraud. Stay greedy, my friends.
Support the channel. Join Matthew Cox's Patreon.
And I've seen him do this over and over again. He says, be here on Monday. And then you get there Monday and he says, oh, no. I had this and this. So it's got to be Tuesday, or it's got to be next Tuesday. And then that comes. And then he says he'll have the motion ready, and he doesn't have it ready. It's okay. We're going to get an extension, and he gets the extension, and you send it in, and it just goes on and on. And it's like, Frank, you said this, like, what's going on? Oh, no. See, what happened is, and he just kind of spins you and spins you and spins you. And what was supposed to be done in a month is now 4 months later with 2 different extensions. And I'm like, look, he'll spin you, and he wants to do it his way. I talk about this in the book. He has a conversation with every person that he represents to begin with, which is, I'm the pilot, you're a passenger on your case. If you, he said, if you tell me how to fly the plane, I will throw you out of the aircraft, and I will give you all your stuff back, and you can fly it yourself. So we ended up calling this, eventually guys would come to him and they would be like, Frank, look at this, or have you thought about this? And he would say, no, I know what I'm doing. We're not going to do that. We're not going to go with that motion. We're not going to go with that case. That case that's not the same as your case. That won't work. And so he would get into arguments, and he'd listen to you, and then he'd get frustrated and he'd yell at you. And we called this being turbine, where we'd say, oh, Frank turbined somebody. They'd go, what do you mean? He threw the guy out of the aircraft into the turbine. And he turbined the guy and gave him his papers back and told him to get out and leave, and he wasn't going to help him. And so he's difficult. He's not. This is basically what I told this other production company, that we've never ended up getting anywhere with it. And what I told them was, let me explain something. Don't think for 1 second that this guy will not have you fly your entire crew down, rent all the equipment, set up everything, sit him down in the chair, and him pull out a contract and say, you're going to sign this. I want 100% control of this and this, and I need to see all editing, and I need to be in control, and ask you to sign it, knowing you've just spent $5,000 or $10,000 to get your whole crew and set the whole thing up. Knowing that, I said, don't put that past him.
Right.
So that's why I keep saying, even if he said, I'll do it, I'd be like, yeah, you know what? Let's get an actor. We're better off with an actor.
For sure. But there's also probably a way to fool him into something. And then you just have to, you have to be sharp, because his logic is it's not going to be good unless I'm in control, and it won't be what it needs to be. And a lot of the time that's not true, but in some cases it is. I feel that way as a movie maker. When I take the wheel on something that someone else is paying for, I know it's going to be best if you just let me finish the job.
Right. And that's the thing. I hired an architect one time. I had drawn out the plans. I had it the way I wanted it. I said, here, I just need you to kind of just be a draftsman. And he goes, well, let me tweak it a little bit, if you don't mind. Like, I mean, this is not quite right, and you don't have enough clearance here. Let me just do a couple of things. And I said, okay, well, you can do a couple of things. That's fine, but this is what I really want. Listen, when this guy gave me his blueprints, they were amazing. He had done things with the space that I had to work with and the budget I had to work with that I never thought of. And in the end, it was an amazing, build that I never could have conceptualized of. He took my idea and he made it 10 times better, because he's a professional and he knows what he's doing. I had a vision. His vision was my vision on steroids.
Right.
And that's what I think. That's what happens when you give these things over to somebody. Like, I can't, I can't go to you and tell you how to create this film. I can say this is the basic, what needs to be covered, but I'm never going to have the experience and knowledge that a real artist is going to have, because I'm just the subject, and it's better that I don't.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in my case, if you collaborate with me, like I just went through something very similar. There's a screenwriter who wrote this movie I shot in Texas, and her heart is very adhered to every word. But a lot of the reasons why they don't allow screenwriters on the set in bigger movies is for that thing. You're so attached to every word, but you have to understand it's going through a process now and an evolution. And much like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, it has to go through its evolution, and now it's in the hands of another artist, and you've got to let that be. That was the decision. The minute you said, I'm writing a screenplay, that is now becoming something else. If you wrote a novel, different story, but it's a screenplay is now in the hands of another artist, and you have to allow that artist to create their work. And I think much too often that when movies are being made, the screenwriters are losing their minds. I mean, think about the case of Natural Born Killers. Quentin Tarantino flipped over what Oliver Stone did with the film. Now, I loved it. I thought it was a masterpiece, and I love Tarantino's movies. But Stone made it his own thing completely, as a filmmaker should in a lot of cases. And Tarantino didn't like that, and he publicly, was against it for many, many years until he sat down with Oliver Stone, I think, and they made peace. But
yeah, I think it's kind of like I saw an interview with John Grisham. They were talking about like The Rainmaker or The Firm or something, and they were saying, man, I saw the movie, it was amazing, it was this, and he said like 3 times in the interview, he goes, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. He said, I wrote the book.
Sure.
Like, I didn't have any multiple times, and he at one point he actually clarified. He said, listen, here's the thing. They were like, don't you like it? He's like, no, I mean, I've got an issue, because what I wrote, if you turned my book into a movie, it would be 20 hours long.
Sure.
He goes, so for what I gave them and what they had to do to consolidate it, I think it's a great film, But what I did was I wrote a book that would have taken 20 hours. He's like, so for me, I still see my book and I can't get past my book, but I understand they have a difficult position, and that was the best they could do. He's like, so, was it good? Yeah. For what I gave them, for what the constraints were, of course.
Sure. And that happens a lot. I mean, it's rare that I think a movie maker has invested so much in a piece of literature that it is the best interpretation possible in the format of motion pictures. Think about The Shining. Stanley Kubrick was a genius, and that movie's amazing. But King and Kubrick were like, oil and water. They weren't working out too well. They didn't mesh.
Did you see there was a movie, I want to say it was, I'm going to get this wrong, 124 hours or something. It was about the guy that was rock climbing and he slipped and a rock crushed his arm and he had to cut his own arm off.
Yes. And I think that Danny Boyle movie is a masterpiece. I didn't read the book though.
Well, I read an article about the kid, the real kid or the guy that cut his own arm off. He was on set the whole time, right? Like they pay you as a consultant. They want you to say, oh, I was there. And they had a scene where he drives his car into the parking lot and he pulls in and he parks. And the sun is just coming up. And, the whole crew is there. And the guy gets out and looks around and walks off and they cut. And so the guy's there and he says, is that it? And they're like, yeah, that's the scene. And he went, oh, you've got to redo it. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I didn't enter from that side. I came in from here and pulled in.
Right.
And so he looked at him and he goes, I mean, that scene look at how many people are around here. Like that scene just cost us. That's 20 grand right now. We just spent 20 grand on that scene right now. And we can't wait another day. The sun won't go back down.
Right.
And he looked at him. He's like, yeah, but that's not what happened. And he looked at him and he said, listen, it may not be 100% accurate. He goes, but it's honest.
Right. You're getting the essence of the situation, and that's important.
Right.
Once it goes into cinema is a different thing. It's not reality.
Right.
Reality is, Andy Warhol's Empire. It's 5 hours of the Empire State Building, or sleep. It's 6 hours of a guy sleeping. That's reality.
Yeah. Nobody wants to see reality.
Yeah. No, make it interesting.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think it's that little clip that I sent you of It's Insanity was I put that together. Just, I'm racking my brains to figure out how to get this thing moving. It's funny because out of all the stories I've got, right, that I've written, it's definitely, to me, it's one of the most interesting stories. And I don't seem to be able to get it off the ground. I have other things that are in the works.
It's in my case, I've made independent documentaries, and the reason why I ended up getting a career in TV is because they were like, "How much did you make this for?" And I said, "Well, I made this one for 12 to 15 on my own with enough equipment that was in the corner that could fit in the corner of this room." That was the first 2-hour documentary, and that's what got me the gig in television. And they were just like, "I just don't know how you did this by yourself." And the thing is, if you cut out all of the different things that they're using, and it goes into the millions, of course, you start to figure out how to make these things for less, but you'll maximize your profits in the end because you own it, because now the playing field is even in terms of distribution. You can get the movie I just mentioned is finally, I allowed it to go into distribution because I found a good channel for it, meaning I get 80% of the profits. It's on a multitude, I think about 15 different streaming networks right now. And I'm shocked, with no advertising whatsoever. A movie I had already made my money back, tenfold, is making money every month, just sitting there, just sitting on Tubi. Weird. Right. So in other words, I just produced 2 new documentaries, and independently, for once again, a fraction of the cost of what my network shows required. And you can do it, and of quality, better quality, and a lot of times, because they're running and gunning regardless of the salaries, regardless of how much you have in the budget, doesn't make the show better. It's about how it's executed. So you can have this meticulous nature, make an adaptation of your book into a documentary independently, fraction of the cost. At the end of the day, it's going to be high quality, match whatever Netflix does. I will bet my house on it. And you end up owning it at the end of the day. And I think that's the way to go. The industry doesn't want you to know this, of course, because then you're putting people out of business. But it's the truth. Not everyone can pull it off. You got to get somebody that's sharp, that has done it and has had the guts to pull it off. But it can be done, and it's being done. And of course, the technology has changed exponentially over the years. So, whereas aerial shots, you used to have to hire a group that would get in a helicopter. Now you have these incredible 4K, 6K drones that are getting gorgeous aerial footage. And you can use those drones creatively, like cranes. And, you don't need a techno crane exactly anymore. You can kind of use these things. Steady cams are much cheaper. So all of it's available to you. You just have to have the courage to just take that step forward and have the right people on your side that are willing to do it. So I'm doing that right now with some of these independent docs, and then you can still license it to networks if you want to. But personally, I'm not exactly interested in doing that in the United States. You want to own the territory here. So, but yeah, man, if you want to, I'm happy to give you any advice on getting this thing off the ground. There are ways you can do it, and with patience, at the end of the day, you're going to be much happier that you did it this way as opposed to allowing the network to take the reins, because again, now they're in control. So it's like the gentleman that you're making the documentary about wanted a certain amount of control. Well, guess what? You have 8 editors, they're in control. They're going to start making cuts and make excuses as to why they couldn't do this or why they didn't keep this moment in that you really liked. And I think something that you have a lot of passion about, which is this subject, should require that attention to detail. And you could do that outside of the system, and don't listen to anyone that tells you you can't license it to the system, because you can.
Right. Yeah. I think, I am passionate about it because, because I was locked up for so long, and I've heard so many stories and I've written so many stories, and it was such an overwhelmingly unique story. Like, how many drug stories do you hear about? It's like, yeah, there's just, and I've written a few of them, but I only wrote the ones that had something different about them. Like, there needed to be something unique. Like, you're a poor kid that grew up in the projects and you sold crack, and your mom was a prostitute and your father was in prison, and it was your only way out to make any money, and you started selling crack, and then you got busted, and there was it's like, okay, that's a tragedy and it's a decent story, but I can throw a rock in prison and hit 300 guys that have that story. And this was a story that the whole time I was locked up, I'd never heard anything like it. And then when I got out and I was interviewing these guys, I kept waiting for them to say that this is absolutely not true. And they didn't. Like, they're not. Like, I'm waiting for this guy to tell me when I interviewed Woody, I was waiting for Woody. I remember I said, Woody, I said, Frank told me about trying to buy these older F-15 and F-16s that had been, he wanted to buy these planes, and then, and he immediately he said, I had nothing to do with that. He said, like, when he was looking into that, like, I was not a part of that. And I thought, like, I'm waiting for him to say that didn't happen, or he wasn't trying to do that, or he wasn't. He's like, no. He definitely wanted to do that. He was definitely talking to the guys. At one point, they even fly in. They even fly in. I forget, it was like an F-16 or an F-18. I have photographs of him with them, and they drop off literature. Wow! And he had a whole plan. He's going to buy like 20 of these things and keep them in Cyprus, and then the Russians will come in, and the Russians will actually, because they're declawed. They take all the firing equipment off of them, so they're just regular jets. And then you can buy them, and you see them flying in air shows and stuff. You can buy them, bring them to Cyprus, and they'll put all the armament back on them.
Wow.
So now you're operating out of Cyprus, which will allow you to do that. And it's like the plan is insane. The plan is just over the top. So yeah,
obviously, he had this in his mind. There's a grand vision and a grand design to everything that he wanted to do was well thought out, and probably he saw a finality before he started to put all the pieces together.
So you want to know one of my favorite things about it is? he's doing all this from Orlando, you know, and I always like to say in the shadow of Disney World, you know, like he's I picture the Disney World globe in the background, you know.
Sure.
It's so comical, but
Yeah.
he's serious. He had a security detail that were, I'm sorry, he had 3 security companies. In the book, I consolidate them. I just call them, I give them one name, which is tactical. I just call it tactical because there was like tactical, personal, tactical, private, military, tactical, private. Like he has different names for them, and I just call it, you know, tactical. But yeah, he had this private security that they had contracts in Afghanistan. They would, you know, they hire private security to do like a convoy, you know, protect a convoy of food or whatever, because the military can't do it all. So he had one of those small companies.
I personally think that you should incorporate the fact that he's a total control freak, and that's part of the thread of your narrative, is that you keep trying to get him to do this honest interview for the documentary, yet he keeps trying to retain that control. And then I emphasize that obviously throughout the story of all of these things you're saying as we go through the narrative, but also incorporate you reaching out to him, trying to get him to just be part of this thing. And then as you go along, you can have different actors or an actor start being him for those moments. I think that would be great to incorporate into the narrative.
Right. And the viewer would never know that person was an actor until the very end.
If you want to do that reveal at the end, or you could just simply tell them that, you know, it's astonishing, even show the actor's reaction to some of the things this guy says and did, you know, like you're incorporating that reaction, you know.
Right.
I think that's what it's all about, is this, you have this outrageous character who, and again, it's open-ended. He might, by the time you're finished making the movie, he might finally say, okay. And he sits down at the end, and as opposed to anything else, you might finally get him to say some words significantly in the last act.
Right.
You know,
yeah,
I'm sure there's a way to do it.
Yeah, I need to really start, you know, I need to get some traction on it.
Sure.
What was the series that you did with, was it Discovery Channel?
Yeah, one of them. Yeah. It was called Strange World. Right now, it's my Off to the Witch podcast, which is mostly, you know, arcane subjects. It ranges everything from to paranormal stories, to violent motion pictures, to I have an episode coming up about a gentleman who invented a technique on how to kill in self-defense with a knife. And it's starting to gain a lot of traction in the martial arts world, but it's not exactly martial arts. And he's literally teaching people how to murder to defend yourself. And that's interesting, because a lot of self-defense courses are more about deflecting, getting away. This is literally how to kill to get away. And I found that to be quite interesting. And he's somebody that I'll have on soon. I interviewed a gentleman who was James Dean's biographer, who covered the tragedy that, you know, Dean died very young in a crash with the Porsche 550 Spider. But after that, that Spider, which was called Little Bastard, went on to be part of several other accidents that killed people because people were cannibalizing parts of the car. So there's this word that it was cursed. And then I think about 60 years ago, the car disappeared. And little pieces here and there were showing up, and some are at museums. And so it's about that curse that follows the Little Bastard and the mystery as to why it disappeared. Who stole it? Where did it go? Where is it now? How many pieces have been shared? And is there really a curse? Because the weirdest thing in that story, and you'll hear in the episode, Sir Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, James Dean, this is just a few days before he died, went into a restaurant, saw Alec Guinness there, and he's like, come and sit at my table. And he's like, hey, man, I want to show you my new car. And Alec Guinness just went outside, looked at it, and Guinness told this later, looking back in hindsight, that he had this strong premonition that he was going to die, that Dean was going to be dead in this car. There was something wrong with this car. And he told that to James Dean, do not get back in this car. And if you do, you'll be dead in 2 days. 2 days later, Dean was dead. And Sir Alec Guinness continued to tell this story on talk shows in the 70s and, throughout his life. What was that premonition? And then later on, 2 doctors got their hands on the chassis and the engine of the Porsche 550 Spider, little bastard. They were both in a race together. Both cars crashed. And the gentleman who took, I believe, part of the axle and part of the engine in his it was a 550 Spider, crashed and died. And so these things continued to happen until the car disappeared. Great story, but it's a 2-part episode.
I mean, I've seen pictures of that car after the crash. Like it was mangled.
It was.
Anybody was able to pull anything off of it.
Yeah, but they got the engine was pulled out of it. Certain things survived. And, re-engineered. And those are true. Those stories are true. People really did die. And I think some things were embellished. The great car designer, George Barris, who made the Batmobile and the Dragula from the Munsters. He was like the one that took it around and showed it as like a sideshow attraction. James Dean's car, death car. People got to look at it. And so a lot of stories came from that. A warehouse burnt down. I mean, like, this is the basis of Christine,
Yeah.
Stephen King's Christine. There were even Dean references in the John Carpenter movie. But I have, so Lee Raskin's a guest for 2 episodes. I interviewed Anton LaVey, the writer of the Satanic Bible. I interviewed Stanton LaVey, his grandson, for 2 episodes. And he tells a great story. Imagine growing up as a 5-year-old in that house. The Black House in San Francisco, where, there's constant sex parties and there's, all of this debauchery going on. And your grandfather is the writer of the Satanic Bible and all this weird stuff is happening in the house. However, this guy's a pretty pleasant guy. And you're seeing Anton LaVey now as someone's grandpa, and so that story was quite interesting to see it in a new perspective. So that's pretty much my podcast. I'm just trying to find people who aren't interviewed so much. And I want to hear stories from people that, have these arcane subjects surrounding it or deeper stories about cinema. There's a guy named Jim Van Beber who made a lot of true crime movies, a movie about the Manson family, a movie about, I grew up in a town where there was a horrible crime and a sensational crime novel written called Say You Love Satan. And it was about a killer named Ricky Casso who murdered a kid named Gary Lowers in the woods. They were on acid. He ended up stabbing him 60 times, carved his eyes out, became a national story, international story, and a book called Say You Love Satan by David St. Clair was written in the early 80s. It was a bestseller at the time. I think it's since been put out of print, maybe by the town of Northport, where it happened, where I grew up, because it put a stain on the town. It was a horrible murder. And Jim made a movie about that. So we talked about that. And he was fascinated at the fact that I grew up in that town. I was a kid playing outside when that happened. And I remember my grandmother coming outside saying, "Get in the house right now," because the whole town is a sleepy little harbor town. Was scared. They found a kid with his eyes carved out in the woods. And, when I was a kid running around, we were allowed to play all day, all night. Even as the sun going down, you hear people calling you inside. Yeah. In this case, everyone was terrified.
When the street lights come in.
Sure. But at that point, the whole town was terrified because they had yet to catch Ricky. They didn't know it was another kid that killed him.
I noticed you don't put this on YouTube. Where's the podcast? Like,
sure, you can just search "Off to the Witch." It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. I don't put. I should start putting more samples on YouTube, but the trailers are on my YouTube channel.
You're right. Yeah, I saw the trailer. But I was wondering, like, even if you don't, because you probably don't record them, right? Like, is it just audio?
Audio only. I was only interested in the audio for this case because I'm doing a docuseries called Off to the Witch Presents, and I feel like that's the visual version of my podcast. And so far I've shot 2 of those. I'm doing a third actually on a true crime case that I've always been interested in. And it's what we were talking a little bit about today. It's like that juxtaposition, that fine line between fiction and reality. Whereas the Phantom Killer is a murderer, Lover's Lane murderer in the late 40s. And I think it was the seminal story that inspired masked killer movies like Friday the 13th, or there was a movie actually based on this case in the 70s called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And Texarkana, Texas, Arkansas border in the late 40s, there was a guy in a hood, potato sack over his head with 2 eye holes cut out, that was waiting for people to park and
Zodiac.
make out. Yeah, he was pretty much the Zodiac killer. He was brutal, mean guy. Got away. They never caught him. There was some speculation as to they knew who he was, but terrorized this town. And it's weird because it happened, I think at that time, maybe Fritz Lang's M or movies like that were the only, killer type slasher films, because in the 40s, there was nothing really to lend to that idea. Those movies came later. So where does this man who had really no influence all of a sudden decides to be this creep in the middle of the night, just preying on people? And it makes you wonder, I guess it's something that's deep inside the human gene, to become a predator. I'm fascinated at that. Like, what is that is inspiring the person to be that way? It's not just simply anger. We've all been angry. You don't go out and murder people.
No, that's really something super, just extremely disturbing that had to have happened, I guess, in your childhood or something. I mean, something's got to be wrong.
Could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually supposed to interview a guy that is a college professor, that they were putting together this massive database of serial killers. I don't know whatever happened with that guy. I was supposed to interview him. And yeah, he was interesting. I had like a 20-minute conversation with him, and then I think he was going to put me. I just so happened in that conversation mentioned the series Criminal Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he knew the woman that was based on the psychologist in that series, and said he was going to reach out to her and put her in contact with me also. And then I don't know whatever happened. But yeah, they're super interesting. Like he was talking about the database, how it connects all these different the different murders and different aspects of the crime that were similar, to try and kind of build like a psychological profile of what types of killers do certain types of things and why.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think outside of the box, I think, to understand what is going on in the mind of one of these killers. You might even have to start thinking like them to understand. And that's a hard thing to do. Like, get into the mind space of a predator. Like, first of all, how would you even become interested in that? You'd have to really be disassociated, angry. What type of person are you going to kill? I wonder if when someone's psychoanalyzing a serial murderer, are they getting into that headspace? Is that part of the technique? I mean, just taking an educated, creative guess, I guess this is what I would do. I would start thinking like a predator to understand them. And I guess that's why they consulted with Ted Bundy for the Green River Killer, right? Like, he was offering information, and he helped them find the Green River Killer. And he said, "Why do you want to kill me? I can help you." I think that's maybe the one flaw of the system, is that maybe they should have kept Bundy alive to use him for what he was offering. Because if he was helping find other serial killers, like, for instance, he said that the Green River Killer would return to the body. Right. He would hide a body and he'd keep going back and doing more with it, because that's what he did. I felt maybe Bundy's information would have been valuable. We could say out of anger, he deserves to die. Of course, like, he should not be on this planet. But if he's in a place where he can't escape anymore, and he's offering his services to help other people survive, to help find these other killers, I think he would have been valuable. And I think it was a missed opportunity to just, electrocute him.
Yeah, I watched that documentary on him. Like, I didn't realize he had escaped twice. Like, he was, yeah. I mean, I had, when I watched that whole the multi-part series documentary on Netflix, I was like shocked at all the things. Like, I thought I kind of knew what happened, but it was it was a crazy story. That was
Yeah.
same type of thing. Like I didn't know he escaped and like stayed gone, and they caught him for like they pulled him over or something, and I forget how he got caught the one of the times. It was just
Sure.
I had no idea. I just assumed I had always thought he had killed like the sorority girls, and then he
Right.
got caught, and then he was put in the electric chair, and that was it. It was over. Like I didn't realize what a massive run he had.
Oh, he's a monster. A monster. Yeah, don't please don't misinterpret what I said earlier. He shouldn't be on this earth, but if he was offering his services to help find other killers, he would have been valuable,
Yeah,
to keep
I
around.
understand. I understand, and trust me, I totally like. Most cases just don't get solved without cooperation, and for cooperation, there's no reason to cooperate for an inmate to cooperate with law enforcement unless there's a benefit. So you have to give them a benefit. In his case, it would have been, as long as you're cooperating, then we're not going to execute you. I mean, there has to be a final benefit in order to get cooperation from inmates.
Sure.
So you can't say, well, they should just do it out of the goodness of their hearts. Well, they're criminals. They're not going to do anything out of the goodness of their heart.
Did you ever hear that story about, and this is a lesser known story, about the guy who was taking a college course on psychiatry, and I believe he was writing to John Wayne Gacy in prison before he was executed. Gacy started responding, and so this guy was getting deeper and deeper into the paper he was writing because he was trying to manipulate Gacy into giving him information. And he looked too deep into the abyss, this kid, and he started having phone calls with this guy at night, and Gacy was calling him from prison at his parents' house, and they had all-night conversations. And then Gacy was like, you've got to go out and do this. He was trying to live vicariously through this kid. Go out to this club, do this. And the kid was listening because he wanted a great paper out of it. So he ends up visiting Gacy in prison before, Gacy was executed, and Gacy attacked him in the cell where they tried to rape him. Yeah. And he didn't, I don't know how far he got with it, but then this gentleman, this kid, this college kid was, ended up committing suicide not too much later. I think he was too deep in this stuff. And obviously we can't get his psychological profile throughout, but he was looking too deep. He was spending too much time in the darkness, I think, with this situation. I think you have to, if you're going to do something like that, you have to, even like being an undercover cop or something, like you got to have a really strong will, extremely strong.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I would be fascinated to have a conversation with them. I'm always fascinated, but I don't ever try and get too deep. I would never try and get too deep. Listen, I used to paint in the painting room at Coleman at the Medium, and there was just like this guy they called him, oh gosh, what was his name? Jim. They called him Old Man Jim. And he was like this, I think he was like a biker or something at one point, but and there was a guy named Big Jim Nolan that was there, that was like head of the Outlaws, but this was this guy's name was they just called him Old Man Jim. And he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s. He'd been locked up for like 20 something years. The state of Florida apparently had put him on trial multiple times, and either he beat them during the trial, he beat the charges, or or they dropped the charges for certain reasons. And I used to like the guy, and I would always joke with him and be nice, talk to him and stuff. And I was walking one time with this other inmate, and I remember the inmate's name. His last name was DiGeronimo, because even though it was Italian, but everybody thought Geronimo was was Indian, but
native, yeah.
Yeah, and in prison they have a little thing they call the sweat lodge, and you can be an Indian. You're like an Indian, and they actually have a special area you can go to and get to smoke tobacco and stuff. And
oh wow,
but yeah, he was DiGeronimo. So I remember we were walking one time, and he goes, "You like Old Man Jim, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, he's all right." And he goes, "Yeah, he is all right. He's a nice guy." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But Cox, like I'd just been there maybe a year or so." And I'm very naive, right? Like I'm very green to the environment. And I kind of knew, I know these are dangerous guys, but he goes, I just want you to know, he said, you know what he did, right? And I went, yeah. I said, he's here for like a drug conspiracy. He said, no. He's here for a drug conspiracy. He said, but Jim went to trial like once or twice in the state for murder and beat it. Then he got arrested one time and he was going to trial again for murder. And there were, I'm going to make up a number, I think it was like 6 witnesses against him. And I said, okay. He said, this is in like the late 70s, early 80s. He said, you know, in the county jails back then, there's not a lot of security. They lock you up and, you know, he goes, and he escapes. He said, a year later, he walks up to the jail, knocks on the jail. They walk in. He said, hey, my name is, you know, Jim, whatever. I'm pretty sure there's a warrant out for me. I escaped from this facility a year ago. So they go, oh, okay. And they look him up. Oh, wow. Okay. And they arrest him and bring him in. Now, this was, by the way, he had escaped like a week before his trial. So he said, I'm ready to go to trial. I turned myself in. I'm ready to go to trial. So they try and put the trial back together. The attorney, the state attorneys, district attorneys, they go and start trying to contact all the witnesses because they're going to go to trial now. They can't contact any of the witnesses. One witness or couple of witnesses disappeared. One was drowned. One had been shot multiple times. You know, and it turns out that all 6 witnesses had ended up dead.
Wow.
And the last witness had been found a few days before Jim turned himself in. So they held him for another month or 2 and they came back and they dropped the charges. And he said it took Jim a year to hunt them all down and kill them. And this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. So it wasn't like he escaped and they immediately contacted all these people. The reason he escaped a week before his trial was because a week before his trial, they gave him the witness list. So now he knows who the witnesses are.
Right.
He escaped. And he turned himself in, obviously, because he knows they're not going to show up. So he said, so just, you know, he's a nice guy. He said, but you just need to know, like, who he is, what you're dealing with when you talk to this guy. So it's funny because probably a couple of weeks later, we were in the paint room, and this CO, a correctional officer, walked in and said, Jim. And he was like, yeah, what's up? What's going on? And the correctional officer says, you know, she's a woman. She starts yelling at him. I told you not to put your canvases up there. I told you they have to be behind the locker. And you're not supposed to. You've been stacking them up there. I told you. And he said, I'm sorry. You're right. I didn't. I thought it would be okay. I'm sorry. And as she's yelling at him, he just starts laughing. And she goes, what's so funny? He goes, I'm sorry. He says, I'm sorry. Go ahead. And she keeps yelling at him. And he goes, okay, I'll take care of it. It'll be done before I leave. She goes, okay. And she walks off. And I looked at him and I said, bro, what was so funny? Why'd you start laughing? And he goes, it's just as she was yelling at me, it struck me that on the street, I'd have cut her head off and stuck it in the trunk of my car and driven around with it for 2 weeks until I couldn't take the smell anymore. He goes, but now I'm in prison and I have to take shit from this fucking woman. He goes, I don't know why that just struck me as funny.
And he was telling you the truth.
Yeah. And he sat there and he just kind of chuckled to himself and went and got the canvases. And I thought, like, that's who you're dealing with. Like,
yeah, be careful.
These are the guys I'm surrounded by. I was surrounded by those guys for like 3 years.
How do you not get too close to someone like that in prison?
You know, it's funny because the guy that I probably consider like my best friend, like to this day, I talk to him. I want him to get out of prison. I love him to death. You know, he's in prison for the murder of 2 federal informants. So, you know, did he do it? I don't think he did it. The government certainly does. And, you know, but to me, he's a good person. He's always been good to me. We have a lot in common. We're very, We click well. It's common. And I mean, literally, you have to understand the kind of conversations you have in prison are vastly different than the conversations you have here. Like, I remember one time I had borrowed like some sodas from him, right? Like he had given me some sodas. And so you go to commissary once a week. So I go to commissary to get the sodas one week, and he doesn't, I don't have soda. They don't have Pepsi. So he goes, oh, it's not a big deal. So the next week I go to get him his sodas again. When I go to commissary, they don't have them. They're out. And I'm walking and I see him and I'm like, hey, what's going on, Pete? And he says, hey, I said, hey man, I said, they didn't have your sodas again. He looked at me, he goes, man, I'm starting to feel like one of your victims, like that. And I go, bro, my victims are alive. And he goes, I didn't do that. What do you And we're laughing and laughing. We're just in tears, laugh. But I mean, that's the kind of conversations you have that people on the street wouldn't understand, joking about that, like that's
Sure.
So yeah, like, to me, it's like, I don't care what happened or how you got in here. You're a friend of mine and I want the best from you and I want you out of prison. And I don't care about what happened. I don't care about that. That's got nothing to do with me. I want the best for you.
Yeah. I mean, we've met a lot of people who have murdered, whether it be in military or law enforcement or, self-defense. It's happened. I think the type I would have a very difficult time trusting is someone who murders for pleasure, or has this propensity to murder, this inherent predator that lives inside of them, because that's what they're always thinking,
Right. Well, we're fascinated by those people, but which crime has the lowest recidivism rate is murder. Like, those guys get out and almost never commit murder again. I mean, you're always going to find some exception with some guy who kills his wife and then gets out, gets remarried and kills another wife, right. That guy's a psycho. But, most murderers get out and they never reoffend. They get a regular job and they're everything's, they live a normal life. Like, the recidivism rate for murder is very high. One of the highest recidivism rates is fraud.
Right.
My particular crime. Like, I have people contact me all the time. They want advice for this and advice for that. I'm always like, look, my first advice is don't ask a guy that was convicted of fraud for advice.
At least you're being honest.
Right. Like, not that I'm going to give you bad advice, but like, that's a bad idea, but yeah, but people do.
You've heard about the gentleman who cut the other gentleman's head off on a bus in Canada. You heard that story?
No.
Sad story, man. So this guy's on the bus and this young guy is there. He's working for the carnival. He's going home to see his family. So they're on a Greyhound, and they went to one stop, and the killer had bummed a cigarette off the kid. So the kid falls asleep, and this guy pulls out a big knife while the kid's sleeping on the bus with a whole bunch of people, stabs him, cuts his head off. The bus stops. Everyone's running, screaming, and he's slicing this kid's head off, and he holds it up to everybody outside. He's just sitting there. He's covered in blood. You could look this one up. So this guy only for insanity only did maybe 2 or 3 years. He's out living his life.
He'd never see the light of day in the United States, but yeah. Oh, what about in Norway? There's that guy that killed like 86 kids and counselor, children and everything. He got like 23 years. Wow. That was the maximum prison sentence they could give you for murder. He got the maximum 23 years. He killed like 80 some odd kids.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. No, it's crazy.
And it was racially motivated. Like, he did it because he didn't like the fact that that their culture was becoming impure by all of the foreigners coming in to Norway. And it was like, so it's also like a hate crime, even though the kids weren't. It's still based on a hate crime. Like, what are you doing?
And he's out living his life.
Yeah. And if you saw, of course, the Norwegian, prisons, like, they have a different stance. Their stance on their criminal justice system is basically, a lot of Europe is like this, where it's like, if you've committed a crime, it's because we as a society have failed you. And so we're going to put you in an environment where we can try and retrain you to be a normal, a good citizen. And in some ways, I very much agree with that. But, you know, in some ways, I agree with the concept of, you know, we just can't have monsters roaming the countryside.
Sure.
So,
It's tough. I think it's obviously, you know, this, it's more in abundance than anyone would like to believe. There are a lot of people out there that are probably serial killers. You know?
oh yeah, there's horrible. There's, like I said, humans are, we're a horrible species.
Sure.
So listen, I'm going to send you my book.
I can't wait to read it.
All right. Do you want to go ahead? Is there anything else you want people to watch your podcast? I know you have to get going.
Just check out Off to the Witch for now. And if you want, come find me on social networks. It's my last name and the number 7, Garetano 7. My YouTube channel's White Phosphorus Pictures, Garetano 7. Just, you know, come and say hello. Come check out what I'm doing. And the podcast is becoming a docu-series in different pieces. So they'll be released next year. And there's a trailer for one of them. I put out a teaser for Halloween, but I'll be putting out an official press release probably in February.
Hey, I appreciate you guys checking out the video, and do me a favor, if you like the video, do me a favor and subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this. Leave me a comment in the comment section and share the video. Also, I'm gonna leave all of Chris's all of his links in the description. Keep in mind, I have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel. Also, if you're interested in thanking me for making the video, you can hit the thank you button. There's the same banner or the scroll under the video where you can do the thumbs up and share the video, that sort of thing. You can scroll over and there's a thank you button where I think it's got a little $sign, and you can donate, you know, like $1.99, $3.99, $49.99, whatever. I really appreciate you guys watching, and thanks very much. And I will see you.